My own mother looked me in the eye in front of 12 board members and said, "You'll never run this company, Harmony." She said it so calmly that no one around the table even flinched. Why was the company's general counsel holding a sealed envelope she refused to explain? Why had 3 board members suddenly stopped looking at my mother and started watching me instead? And why did I have the strange feeling that today's vote wasn't really about choosing a CEO? The document inside that envelope had been hidden for years. My mother believed it would never be found. She had no idea I'd spent the last 6 months quietly following every altered record, every missing file, and every lie that led us to this room. Before I tell you how that morning unfolded, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice and finding the strength to stand your ground, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined me for the rest of this journey. 6 months earlier, if you had asked anyone inside Vargas Biotech who actually kept the company running, most people would have answered with my name. If you had asked who would become the next CEO, almost every one of those same people would have answered with my brothers. That contradiction had defined my entire adult life. My name is Harmony Vargas. I was 38 years old, the chief operating officer of Vargas Biotech, and the daughter of our CEO, Victoria Vargas. We were a mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturing and research company headquartered in Chicago, employing just over 1,800 people across 3 states. My father had founded the company 32 years earlier in a rented warehouse with 4 employees and a single production line. By the time he passed away from pancreatic cancer 12 years earlier, Vargas Biotech had become one of the most respected specialty manufacturers in the Midwest. After his death, my mother became CEO. At first, no one questioned that decision. She had worked beside my father from the beginning. She understood the business. She knew our investors, our suppliers, and our employees by name. Even I believed she was the right person to lead us through that painful transition. Looking back now, I don't think power changed my mother overnight. I think grief and fear slowly did. She became convinced that keeping control meant protecting everything my father had built. Somewhere along the way, protecting the company became protecting her authority. And protecting her authority eventually meant protecting my older brother. Ethan Vargas was 41. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even incompetent. He simply wasn't a leader. He loved conferences, networking dinners, magazine interviews, and shaking hands with investors. He could charm almost anyone during a 30-minute meeting. But once the cameras disappeared, so did his attention. He rarely finished projects. He hated operational details. Budgets bored him. Compliance reports irritated him. Employee issues made him uncomfortable. If a problem couldn't be solved by making 3 phone calls over lunch, he usually lost interest. I was the opposite. I loved systems. I loved fixing inefficient processes. I enjoyed reading contracts line by line. I could spend an entire afternoon analyzing manufacturing reports because every percentage point mattered. While Ethan introduced products to reporters, I worked with engineers to make sure those products actually reached hospitals safely and on schedule. I never needed applause. Watching the company improve had always been enough. For years, that arrangement worked. At least I thought it did. Every Monday morning, I chaired our executive operations meeting: production, quality assurance, finance, regulatory affairs, supply chain, human resources. Every department reported directly to me before presenting final recommendations to my mother. When COVID disrupted supply chains years earlier, it had been my team that redesigned vendor contracts and prevented layoffs. When a manufacturing line failed inspection, I spent 3 nights sleeping in my office until we corrected every deficiency before the FDA returned. When a nationwide shortage threatened one of our critical medications, I negotiated emergency production partnerships that kept hospitals supplied. My mother praised the company publicly after every success. She just rarely mentioned who had done the work. I told myself that didn't matter. Leaders weren't supposed to chase recognition. At least that was what I believed until one afternoon in Boston. The annual Biotechnology Leadership Summit attracted executives from across the country. My mother had been invited to participate in a panel discussing family-owned companies. I attended because our operations team was presenting a Manufacturing Innovation Award later that afternoon. Before the panel began, several journalists gathered around our group. One reporter smiled at my mother. "Mrs. Vargas, everyone seems curious about succession planning. Have you decided who will eventually lead Vargas Biotech?" I wasn't expecting her to name me. Honestly, I expected a diplomatic answer. Something like, "The board will make that decision when the time comes." Instead, she smiled toward Ethan. "We're fortunate to have strong family leadership." The reporter nodded. "And your son has become increasingly visible." My mother laughed softly. "Ethan has the instincts my husband always admired. He's preparing for much greater responsibilities." No one looked at me. I was standing less than 6 feet away. The reporter glanced in my direction. "And your daughter?" My mother answered before I could speak. "Harmony is exceptional where she is." Where she is? Not where she could become. Where she belonged. I smiled because cameras were still recording. Inside, something shifted. That evening, our executive team gathered for dinner. One of our vice presidents congratulated Ethan. "I guess we'll all be reporting to you one day." Ethan grinned. "I've been learning from Mom for years." I nearly laughed. Learning what he had attended maybe half the operational reviews over the previous year. Michael Dawson, our CFO, quietly looked down at his menu instead of joining the conversation. I noticed. Michael had worked with my father longer than anyone still employed by the company. He rarely showed emotion. That night, he seemed deeply uncomfortable. On the flight back to Chicago, I reviewed presentation notes on my laptop. An internal notification appeared. The executive leadership meeting scheduled for Monday morning had been updated. I clicked it. Access denied. I frowned. That couldn't be right. As COO, I automatically chaired those meetings. I refreshed the calendar. The meeting still existed. Only now my name wasn't listed. Ethan's was. At first, I assumed someone in administration had made a mistake. It happened occasionally. Monday morning confirmed otherwise. When I walked toward the executive conference room, my assistant intercepted me. "Harmony." She looked nervous. "I thought you already knew." "Knew what?" "Mrs. Vargas moved the meeting upstairs." "Without telling me." She hesitated. "I wasn't supposed to say anything." I walked upstairs anyway. The conference room doors were closed. Through the glass wall, I saw Ethan standing at the head of the table. He was presenting quarterly manufacturing performance. My presentation, my charts, my operational strategy. Several executives noticed me outside. No one opened the door. I stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Not because I wanted to interrupt, because I wanted to understand. My mother looked up. Our eyes met through the glass. She didn't appear surprised. She didn't wave me inside. She simply continued listening to Ethan as if I weren't standing there. That hurt more than anger ever could. I returned quietly to my office. An hour later, Michael Dawson knocked on my door. He closed it behind him. "I'm sorry." "For what?" He sighed heavily. "I assumed Victoria had already spoken with you." "About replacing me." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat across from my desk. Then he said something that would stay with me for months. "Harmony, some transitions begin long before people realize they've started." What does that mean? Michael looked toward my office window before answering. I think decisions have been moving in one direction for much longer than you know. Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated. He stood up almost immediately. I shouldn't have said even that. He reached the door, then stopped. One hand remained on the handle. Without turning around, he added quietly, If I were you. He paused. I'd start paying attention to the meeting records instead of what people are saying. Then he walked away. I stared at the closed door for a long time. Meeting records, not conversations, not promises, not family, records. That afternoon, I logged into our internal governance system, expecting to confirm that Monday's meeting had simply been reassigned. Instead, I found something much stranger. The calendar invitation had been edited late Friday evening. The change log showed my name had been manually removed. And the approval came from an executive account that only one person in the company was authorized to use. My mother's. I didn't confront my mother. That surprised even me. 6 months earlier, I probably would have marched into her office with a printed copy of the calendar log and demanded an explanation. Instead, I closed my laptop. Michael Dawson's words echoed in my head. Pay attention to the meeting records instead of what people are saying. For the first time in my life, I accepted that this wasn't a disagreement between a mother and her daughter. It was a governance issue, and governance was built on documentation, not emotions, not assumptions. Documentation. The next morning, I arrived before sunrise. The security guard in the lobby smiled. You're early again, Miss Vargas. I couldn't sleep. He chuckled. You and half the operations team. By 6:15 a.m., I was alone in my office with coffee, 2 monitors, and access to nearly every operational record the company had generated over the previous 5 years. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for patterns. Individual incidents could be explained away. Patterns couldn't. I began with meeting minutes. Every executive committee meeting required an official record before anything could be presented to the board. Those records passed through Olivia Grant, the board secretary. Olivia had worked for Vargas Biotech almost as long as I had. She was meticulous. Every document had timestamps, revision histories, approvals. Nothing disappeared without leaving a trail. At least that was the theory. I exported 12 months of meeting minutes into a comparison program. The first hour produced nothing unusual. Neither did the second. Then I noticed something almost invisible. A strategic manufacturing initiative approved the previous October listed Ethan as its executive sponsor. I frowned. That couldn't be right. I had personally led that project. I'd negotiated every supplier contract. I'd chaired every planning meeting. I'd presented the implementation schedule to the board myself. Yet the final version of the minutes credited Ethan. Maybe I remembered incorrectly. I opened the presentation slides. There I was. Harmony Vargas, presenter, project lead. Then I opened the approved meeting packet distributed before the meeting. Again, my name. So how had Ethan become the executive sponsor in the official minutes? I checked the revision history. Version 1, Harmony Vargas. Version 2, Harmony Vargas. Version 3, executive sponsor Ethan Vargas. Modification completed 3 days after board approval. I leaned closer to the screen. 3 days later, that wasn't normal. Approved minutes weren't supposed to be rewritten except to correct spelling or factual errors. Changing executive responsibility was something entirely different. I printed the file, not because I needed paper, because holding it made the inconsistency feel real. I continued searching. The second discovery came faster, a product expansion project completed 8 months earlier. Original draft, Harmony. Final version, Ethan. Third example, Same pattern. Fourth, again, not every project. Only the successful ones. The failed initiatives still listed Ethan exactly where he'd originally appeared. I leaned back in my chair. Someone wasn't simply promoting my brother. Someone was quietly rewriting the company's history. Around 9 o'clock, I walked downstairs to the information technology department. Nathan Brooks looked surprised to see me. "Harmony, do you have 5 minutes? For you," he smiled. "Always." Nathan had been our IT director for nearly a decade. He wasn't interested in office politics. He cared about cybersecurity system integrity and accurate records. Exactly the kind of person I needed. I placed 3 printed meeting minutes on his desk. "I need a technical question answered." He adjusted his glasses. "Go ahead." "Can someone change metadata after a document is finalized?" He nodded. "Depends. On what? Permissions." "What about board records?" He became serious. "Those are heavily restricted." "Can revision logs be erased? Not without leaving another log." "What if someone has administrator privileges?" Nathan shook his head. "Our governance archive creates permanent audit records, so every edit is preserved. If someone changed something," he pointed toward my documents, "the system knows exactly who, when, and from which account." I hesitated. "I'd like copies of the audit logs." Nathan looked at me carefully. "For litigation, no. Board review. I honestly don't know yet." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said something unexpected. "As COO, you're authorized to request audit information for operational records. So you can provide it?" "I can." He paused. "But once I generate it, the request itself becomes part of the permanent record." Meaning someone would know I'd asked. I considered that. If my mother was manipulating records, she would notice immediately. "Not yet." "I'm going to wait." Nathan nodded. "Probably wise." As I stood to leave, he stopped me. "Harmony." I turned around. "I've worked here 10 years. "So have I." "I've never seen you ask a question without already suspecting the answer." I smiled weakly. "I hope I'm wrong." "So do I." Back upstairs, I avoided looking into my mother's office. She was meeting with Ethan. Their door remained closed for almost 2 hours. When Ethan finally came out, he was laughing. He noticed me. "Hey. Morning. You missed another executive session." "I heard. Mom's restructuring leadership." "I'm aware." He leaned casually against my office doorway. "You shouldn't take it personally." I looked up from my laptop. I wasn't planning to. "She's just preparing for the future." "What future? Our future." He smiled. "You know how Mom thinks." Actually, I was beginning to realize I didn't. That afternoon, I received another surprise. Olivia Grant appeared outside my office carrying a stack of board folders. "Harmony." "Hi, Olivia." She stepped inside and quietly closed the door. That alone made me uneasy. Olivia never closed doors. She spoke softly. "I think these belong to you." She placed a binder on my desk. It was from a board committee meeting I'd apparently never attended. "I wasn't invited." "I know." She looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't allowed to send you the agenda." "Who decided that?" She hesitated. I shouldn't answer." "You've never lied to me before. I don't intend to start now." She lowered her voice even further. "The instruction came directly from the CEO's office." "Not surprising." "What was discussed?" "I can't tell you." "Because it's confidential," she nodded. "And because I promised." I respected that. Olivia had spent 20 years protecting board confidentiality. I wasn't going to ask her to break that trust. She turned toward the door, then stopped. Without facing me, she said quietly, "I can tell you one thing." I waited. The committee wasn't discussing operations. What were they discussing? She finally looked back at me. Leadership succession. My heartbeat slowed. They're replacing me. She didn't answer. Instead, she said, I think you should review every committee record from the past 18 months. 18 months? She nodded. Don't just read the minutes. What else? The distribution lists. She left before I could ask why. Distribution lists. That seemed oddly specific. I reopened my laptop and began comparing who had received confidential board materials over the previous year. The pattern appeared almost immediately. Several succession planning documents had been distributed to Ethan. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that the company's chief operating officer had never been copied. Not once. I was reading through another committee packet when an automated notification appeared in the corner of my screen. Document updated committee record 14B, succession planning. Modified 11:42 a.m. I hadn't even opened that file before. Someone had changed it today while I was sitting in my office. I clicked the audit history. Access denied. Restricted by executive authorization. At the bottom of the screen, however, one line remained visible before the system blocked everything else. Last modified by Executive Office. V. Vargas. My mother wasn't just excluding me from succession planning. She was still actively rewriting the records. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't about making Ethan look qualified. It was about making me disappear from the company's history. Just as I was absorbing that thought, my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't expected. Margaret Sinclair, Independent Board Director. When I answered, her voice was calm. Harmony, I'd prefer not to discuss this over the phone. My grip tightened around the receiver. Then where? There's a small restaurant on East Wacker. She paused. Tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. Is this about succession? Another pause. Bring nothing from the office. Then she added one sentence that made me cancel every appointment on my calendar for the next day. There are things your mother doesn't know the board has started questioning. The restaurant Margaret Sinclair chose wasn't the kind of place executives used for business dinners. There were no private dining rooms, no polished marble floors, no photographers waiting outside. It was a quiet neighborhood Italian restaurant, tucked between a bookstore and a tailor shop along East Wacker Drive. The kind of place where conversations disappeared beneath the sound of silverware and jazz music. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habit. Margaret was already there. She wasn't wearing one of her tailored boardroom suits. Instead, she had on a navy sweater and simple pearl earrings. Without the formal setting, she looked less like a corporate director and more like someone's favorite aunt. She smiled as I approached. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure whether I should. You should. The waiter poured water before either of us opened a menu. Margaret waited until he walked away. I'm going to say something that stays between us unless the board formally asks you about it. I nodded. I understand. She studied my face for a moment. You remind me of your father. I smiled politely. People have been saying that my whole life. I'm not talking about appearance. She leaned forward. I'm talking about how carefully you listen before you speak. That caught me off guard. My father used to say the quickest person in the room was rarely the wisest. I'd forgotten that until Margaret mentioned it. She continued. Do you know why I joined the board 12 years ago? I assumed my father recruited you. He did. What did he tell you? That family businesses don't usually fail because of markets. She paused. They fail because people stop separating family from governance. The sentence lingered between us. Margaret folded her hands. Harmony, several directors have become concerned.
About my mother. About a decision-making.
I stayed quiet. The concern isn't that Victoria prefers Ethan.
I thought that was exactly the concern.
It isn't. She shook her head. Every parent has favorites. The honesty surprised me. The board doesn't regulate affection. What does it regulate? Whether the CEO is acting in the best interests of shareholders. That distinction mattered.
More than I realized.
Margaret reached into her leather folder and removed a copy of the company's corporate governance guidelines. Not confidential, public, available to every executive. She turned to one highlighted paragraph. When directors vote for a CEO, they're not choosing the child the current CEO loves most. She looked directly at me. They're choosing the person most capable of protecting the company. I know. I'm not sure Victoria still remembers that. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks.
Why tell me this now?
Because the board has spent months hoping the situation would correct itself.
And
it hasn't. She sighed. Instead, we've noticed increasing signs that important governance decisions are being influenced by family loyalty. My stomach tightened. What signs? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me a question. Have you noticed you're no longer invited to certain committee meetings?
So you know.
We all know. Then why didn't anyone stop it? Because committee assignments fall within the CEO's authority.
So it's legal.
Legal doesn't always mean wise. I appreciated that answer. Too many people confused those concepts. Margaret continued. The problem isn't exclusion.
What is it?
If succession planning is being discussed without the company's chief operating officer present, the board deserves a business reason.
There isn't one. We haven't seen one either.
The waiter arrived with dinner. Neither of us touched it for several minutes. Finally, Margaret broke a piece of bread. Harmony.
Yes.
I want to ask something uncomfortable. Go ahead. If the board selected you as CEO tomorrow, I interrupted. They won't. Answer anyway. I hesitated. I'd accept.
Would you fire your mother?
No. Your brother. Not automatically. She watched me carefully. Why not? Because leadership isn't punishment. Her expression softened. What would you do? I'd evaluate everyone under the same standards. Even Ethan. Especially Ethan. Margaret smiled for the first time that evening. I was hoping you'd say that. Why? Because some people fight for power. She folded her napkin. Others fight for principles.
I don't want power. I believe you.
That surprised me.
So does Charles Bennett.
The chairman. She nodded. He hasn't said much. Charles almost never does.
Does he agree with you?
He agrees that the board has unanswered questions. Questions, not conclusions. That was encouraging. It meant people were still looking for facts, not choosing sides. Margaret reached into her folder again. This time she removed a much older document. The cover page carried my father's signature.
This is one of the last governance reviews your father completed.
I immediately recognized his handwriting. The ink had faded slightly with age.
He believed governance should outlive personalities.
I slowly turned the pages. Most of it discussed ordinary board procedures, voting thresholds, committee structures, conflict of interest policies. Then I reached a sentence that made me stop. If future leadership creates material conflicts between family relationships and fiduciary obligations. The paragraph ended with a reference. See succession review letter? I looked up. What's that? Margaret shook her head. We don't know. You've never seen it? No. Then why reference it? Because your father clearly intended it to exist. I flipped through the remaining pages. Nothing. No attachment. No appendix. Only the reference. When was this written?
About 14 years ago.
Has anyone looked for the letter?
Many times. And no one has found it.
A strange feeling settled over me. My father had never been careless. If he'd referenced another document, he expected someone to read it someday, which meant the letter had existed. Somewhere. I need to find it. Margaret nodded. So do we. I frowned. We? The governance committee voted unanimously last week. For what? To locate every succession document your father ever created. I stared at her. The entire committee.
Yes. Does my mother know? No. Why not?
Because until we have evidence, she let the sentence trail away. Evidence. Again. Everything kept coming back to evidence. Not opinions, not family stories. Evidence. Margaret finished her tea before speaking again. Harmony, I want to give you one piece of advice. I'm listening.
Don't spend your energy proving your mother wrong.
What should I prove? Prove the record's right. The difference sounded small. It wasn't. If I spent my time arguing with Victoria, we'd become two family members accusing each other. If I followed documents, policies, and governance rules, the conversation became objective. That was exactly how my father had always solved problems. When dinner ended, Margaret handed me a business card. On the back, she had written 3 words: Corporate Records Archive.
What's this?
A storage facility. I've been there. Not that one. She smiled faintly. Before your current headquarters was built, Vargas Biotech stored governance files in another archive. I've never heard of it. Most executives haven't. Is that where the letter is?
I honestly don't know.
She stood.
But if I were looking for documents your father personally protected,
she slipped on her coat.
That's where I'd begin. The next morning I arrived at the archive shortly after 8.
The building was nearly empty. An elderly records supervisor searched the database while I waited. After several minutes, he frowned.
That's odd.
What is... We still have references to several governance files.
Good. But the boxes themselves aren't here.
They've been moved, apparently.
When?
He clicked through another screen.
About 9 months ago.
Who authorized it? He adjusted his glasses.
The request came from corporate legal.
My pulse quickened.
Do you have the transfer paperwork?
I should. He disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a faded file folder. Inside was a single authorization form. Across the bottom, under Approved By, was one unmistakable signature. Amelia Foster, General Counsel. But another handwritten note had been added beneath it. Per CEO instruction, Victoria Vargas. Someone hadn't merely failed to find my father's records. Someone had intentionally moved them. And no one seemed willing to tell me where they had gone. I stared at the transfer authorization for a long time. Not because it proved my mother had done something illegal. It didn't. As CEO, Victoria had every right to relocate company records. The question wasn't whether she had the authority. The question was why those particular records had been moved. The elderly archive supervisor noticed my expression. Everything all right? I carefully slid the document back across the desk.
Can you tell where the boxes were sent?
He typed another search. After nearly a minute, he frowned again. That's strange. What is... The destination field is blank.
Blank.
I've never seen that before.
Is it possible someone forgot to enter it?
He shook his head immediately.
Our system won't process a transfer unless a destination is entered.
Then why isn't it here? I honestly don't know. He looked genuinely confused. The destination existed at some point, so someone removed it. He looked uncomfortable. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He lowered his voice. Only corporate legal can edit archive transfer records. Corporate legal. Amelia Foster, again. I thanked him for his time and walked back toward my car. Outside, the Chicago wind cut through my coat, but I barely noticed. My mind wasn't on the weather. It was replaying every conversation I'd had over the previous month. Michael had told me to follow the records. Nathan had explained the audit logs. Margaret had pointed me toward my father's governance documents. Now, every road seemed to lead to the legal department. Not Ethan, not operations, legal. That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Amelia Foster. She accepted within minutes. Amelia had been Vargas Biotech's general counsel for almost 9 years. She had joined after working for one of Chicago's largest corporate law firms. Professional, measured, almost impossible to read. When I entered her office, she stood to shake my hand. Harmony, thanks for seeing me. Of course. She gestured towards a chair. What can I help you with? I placed a copy of the archive transfer authorization on her desk. I found this today. She glanced down. Recognition flashed across her face for less than a second. Then it disappeared. I remember authorizing the transfer. I assumed you would. She nodded. Corporate records are relocated periodically. I'm sure they are. Neither of us mentioned the real issue. Finally, I asked it directly. Where did these boxes go? Amelia folded her hands. I don't remember. I almost smiled, not because I believed her, because she had answered like a lawyer. Technically, carefully, without saying anything that could later be proven false. You don't remember. It was months ago. Were the records destroyed? No. Digitized. I can't discuss internal legal processes. Amelia, I leaned forward. I'm not asking about litigation. I'm aware. I'm asking about governance records created by my father. She remained silent. I waited. Finally, she spoke. Harmony, your father believed in documenting everything. I know. So did I. She looked toward the window. There are reasons certain files receive additional protection. Protection from whom? Sometimes, she paused, from people who misunderstand them. I frowned. Are you saying the records still exist? I didn't say that. You implied it. I said they're protected. That's not the same thing. No, it isn't. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. May I offer some advice? I'd appreciate it. Don't confuse my role with your mother's. What does that mean? My client is Vargas Biotech. She held my gaze. Not Victoria Vargas. The sentence settled heavily between us. I had always assumed Amelia's loyalty belonged to my mother. Perhaps I'd been wrong. Then help me understand. I can't. Because of privilege. So, she nodded once. But I can tell you something else. I waited. Corporate governance has its own timeline. I'm not sure I follow. Some questions can't legally be answered. She looked directly at me. Until the right governing body asks them. The board. She couldn't tell me, but perhaps she could tell them. I left her office with more questions than answers. Still, one thing had changed. Amelia hadn't tried to discourage me. She hadn't defended my mother. She hadn't warned me to stop looking. For an attorney, silence often carried meaning. That evening, my mother called. It had been almost 2 weeks since we'd spoken outside formal meetings. Harmony. Hi, Mom. I hear you've been visiting archives. Straight to the point. I've been reviewing historical governance records.
You've been asking questions.
I have, she sighed. You always make things harder than they need to be. Do I?
Yes. You could simply trust me.
There it was. The sentence I'd heard since childhood. Trust me. When I was 10, it meant she knew which school was best. When I was 22, it meant she knew which career decisions mattered. Now at 38, it apparently meant I shouldn't question missing governance records. I answered quietly. Dad taught me that trust and verification aren't opposites. Silence. Then she laughed softly.
Your father also trusted me. I believe he did. So should you. I do trust that you're acting according to what you believe.
Another pause.
But that's different from verifying corporate decisions. Her voice cooled immediately.
This is exactly why you'll never lead this company. I didn't react. Instead, I asked a simple question.
Why?
She seemed surprised.
What?
Why won't I ever lead it?
You want the honest answer.
I do.
Because you see policies before people.
I almost interrupted. She continued. You'd rather be right than keep the family together. I looked out my office window at employees leaving for the day. Hundreds of families depended on this company.
Mom?
I've spent 15 years protecting what your father built.
So have I. No.
Her voice sharpened. You've protected procedures.
I've protected people.
I thought about that. Then I answered carefully.
If procedures protect people...
She didn't let me finish. Ethan understands loyalty. I closed my eyes. There it is. What? The real issue. What issue? This has never been about qualifications. She didn't respond. It's about loyalty.
I'm asking you to choose family. I already have.
You don't act like it. I took a slow breath. I've chosen this family every day for 15 years. I've worked weekends. I've canceled vacations.
I've slept in my office during FDA inspections.
I've missed birthdays. I've postponed my own life. I didn't do those things for a title. I did them because I believed we were building something together. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she said quietly,
You've always been difficult.
That sentence hurt far more than I expected. Not because she said it, because I realized she'd believed it for years. The conversation ended without either of us saying goodbye. I sat alone in my office long after sunset. At some point, my assistant knocked gently.
Harmony, come in.
She stepped inside carrying a thin inter-office envelope. This arrived by courier.
No return address.
She shook her head. It was marked confidential. After she left, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature, no note, just a photocopy. At the top was the heading Governance Committee, Archive Inventory. Several file numbers had been highlighted. One entry immediately caught my attention. Succession Review Letter, Status Duplicate, Copy Retained, Secretary's Personal File. My heart skipped. A duplicate copy, not in corporate archives, not in legal, not destroyed. Someone had kept a personal copy. At the bottom of the page, another line had been circled in blue ink. Secretary of Record Eleanor, retire, 2019. I whispered her name aloud. Eleanor Hayes. I remembered her. She had worked beside my father for decades before retiring quietly a few years after his death. If anyone understood how he organized sensitive documents, it would be Eleanor. Taped to the back of the photocopy was a yellow sticky note. Only 5 handwritten words. She never threw anything away. I read the sticky note 3 times. She never threw anything away. There wasn't a signature, no fingerprints, no return address, just 5 words written in dark blue ink. Whoever had sent the envelope clearly didn't want credit. They wanted me to keep looking, I folded the paper carefully and locked it inside my briefcase. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Not because I thought I had already won, because I finally had a direction. The next morning, I called Human Resources. "Could you update Eleanor Hayes' contact information for me?" The HR coordinator hesitated. "I don't think we can release a retired employee's personal information." "I understand. I can ask whether she'd be willing to contact you. That would help." By lunchtime, my phone rang. The number wasn't saved. "This is Harmony." A warm, older voice answered. "I heard you've been asking about me." "Eleanor. I suppose I'm harder to find these days." I smiled despite myself. "I appreciate you calling." "I expected this day eventually." That sentence caught my attention. "You expected it?" "Your father prepared for many things." She paused. "Even this." My heart began beating faster. "Would you be willing to meet—" "I would." "When—" "Tomorrow morning." She gave me the address to a small house in Evanston. Before hanging up, she added one request. "Don't bring anyone." The following morning, I drove north along the lake under gray skies. Eleanor's house was modest. White siding, a small porch, hydrangeas blooming beneath the windows. Nothing about it suggested that one of the most important governance records in our company's history might be sitting inside. She answered the door before I knocked. "Harmony." She smiled warmly. "You look exactly like your father when you're worried." I laughed softly. "I've heard that a lot lately." She invited me inside. The living room felt frozen in another era. Bookshelves filled every wall. Photo albums, old legal binders, handwritten notebooks. Nothing appeared digital. Nothing looked rushed. Everything had a place. "I've kept busy since retirement." "I can see that." She poured tea before either of us mentioned the company. Only after we were both seated did she speak. "I know why you're here. I think you do. You want the succession review letter." I didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I wondered how long it would take." "You knew people were looking for it." "I knew someone eventually would." "Why didn't you give it to the board years ago?" She smiled gently. "Because your father specifically instructed me not to." I blinked. "What?" "He left written instructions." She stood and walked toward an old oak cabinet. After unlocking the bottom drawer with a brass key, she removed a flat archival box. Inside were several carefully labeled folders. She lifted one. On the front, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. "To be released only if necessary." My throat tightened. Eleanor placed the folder between us but didn't open it. "Before I hand this to you," she looked directly into my eyes, "you need to understand why it exists." "I'm listening." "The year before your father became ill, he noticed something." "What?" "He noticed your mother and Ethan beginning to make decisions together without documenting them." I frowned. "That long ago? It wasn't serious at first." "What kind of decisions?" "Small hiring choices, vendor preferences, committee recommendations." She shrugged. "Nothing illegal. But he worried that one day family relationships might outweigh governance." That sounded exactly like something my father would say. He never accused anyone. "No, he simply believed good governance should protect good people." She smiled faintly. "Especially when emotions become complicated." I nodded. "That sounds like him." "It does." She rested one hand gently on the folder. "The letter wasn't written to choose a favorite child." I didn't think it was. It was written to protect the company from future conflicts. That distinction mattered. More than ever. Eleanor finally opened the folder. Inside lay 3 separate documents. The first was a signed letter addressed to the board of directors. The second was a memorandum prepared by the company's outside law firm. The third contained notarized signature certifications. Every page carried original signatures. Every page had been preserved in protective sleeves. Nothing looked altered. Nothing looked copied. Everything appeared authentic. My father had prepared this carefully, very carefully. I reached toward the first page. Eleanor gently stopped me.
Not yet.
I looked up.
You need to hear one more thing.
I leaned back.
When your father
delivered these documents, she spoke almost in a whisper. He made me promise something.
What promise?
If a future CEO election became influenced by family loyalty, she paused. These documents were to go directly to the independent directors. Not the CEO, not the family, the independent directors. I suddenly understood why Margaret Sinclair had never heard of the letter. It had never been delivered. It had only been safeguarded.
Why keep it all these years?
Because no triggering event had occurred. And now, Eleanor gave me a sad smile, I've spent months reading the business pages. I saw your brother appearing everywhere. I saw board announcements. I saw organizational changes. She folded her hands. And then I saw your name quietly disappearing. You noticed that anyone who knew your father's management style would. She took a slow breath. He never built Vargas Biotech around one child. He built it around accountability. My eyes drifted back to the documents.
So I can take these?
You may, but only after one condition.
What condition?
You don't use them to attack your mother.
I won't.
You give them to the proper governing authority. The board. She smiled. Exactly. I nodded without hesitation. I promise. She handed me the folder. It felt surprisingly heavy. Not physically, emotionally. Inside wasn't proof that I deserved to become CEO. It was something much more important. Proof that my father believed no member of our family should ever control the succession process alone. As I carefully placed the documents inside my briefcase, Eleanor reached for one final envelope. This wasn't inside the archive. I looked at it. No company logo, just my name, Harmony, written in my father's handwriting. He left that separately. For me.
Yes.
When should I open it? She looked at me for a long moment.
Not yet.
I frowned.
Why?
Because that letter isn't about the company. It's about you. She gently rested her hand over mine.
Read it after the board makes its decision.
I slipped the envelope into my briefcase without opening it. On the drive back to Chicago, I called only one person. Margaret Sinclair. She answered after the second ring. Harmony, I found it. Silence. Then one careful question.
Are you certain?
I have the original letter. I glanced at the briefcase on the passenger seat, along with the legal memorandum and signature certifications. Margaret didn't speak for several seconds. When she finally did, her voice sounded steadier than I expected. Don't bring them to the office.
I wasn't planning to.
Good. What should I do? I'll convene the governance committee. When? As soon as possible. She paused. And Harmony? Yes. For the first time since this began. I could hear relief in her voice. The board will be reviewing evidence instead of rumors. Less than an hour after I ended the call, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Margaret. It was a company-wide executive notification. Special meeting of the board of directors scheduled. Subject independent governance review. My mother hadn't requested the meeting. The board had. The email reached every executive at exactly 8:03 Monday morning. Special meeting of the Board of Directors Purpose Independent Governance Review. Attendance board members, CEO, General Counsel, CFO, COO, nothing more. No agenda. No supporting documents. No explanation. Within 15 minutes, the entire executive floor was buzzing. People lowered their voices whenever I walked past. Assistants suddenly found reasons to linger near conference rooms. Managers who normally greeted me with easy smiles now looked uncertain, as if they were afraid that acknowledging me might be interpreted as choosing a side. Corporate uncertainty has a way of changing ordinary behavior. Nobody knows where to stand. I wasn't interested in the gossip. I was interested in preparing. At 9 o'clock, I met privately with Margaret Sinclair and Charles Bennett in a conference room that overlooked Lake Michigan. Amelia Foster was already there. The original documents from Eleanor Hayes rested inside a locked leather portfolio on the table. Margaret looked at me. "Before we begin, I want to be absolutely clear." I nodded. "The Governance Committee has not concluded that anyone has violated the law." "I understand. We're reviewing whether proper governance procedures were followed." Charles folded his reading glasses. "Facts first. No assumptions. No accusations." That was exactly how I wanted this handled. Amelia carefully removed the first document from the portfolio. She examined every page. Then she compared the signatures with archived corporate records. Nearly 20 minutes passed without anyone speaking. Finally, she looked up. "I've completed a preliminary authentication." Charles asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Your opinion?" "The signatures appear authentic." Margaret leaned forward. "And the notarizations?" "I've already contacted the notary's successor office. They confirm the commission number." She paused. "Unless additional evidence suggests otherwise, I have no reason to question these documents." A weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders, not because I had won, because the evidence could finally speak for itself. Charles closed the folder. "The full board will review these tomorrow." "Will Victoria receive copies beforehand?" I asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because the Governance Committee has an obligation to preserve the integrity of the review." That made sense. Nobody should have the opportunity to influence the process before directors examine the documents themselves. As we were leaving, Charles stopped me. "Harmony." "Yes, I have one request." "Anything." "When questions become personal tomorrow," he looked directly at me, "answer as the COO. Not as the daughter." He nodded. "The board already understands your family relationship." "They need to understand your professional judgment." "I will." He smiled faintly. "I believe you." The board meeting lasted almost 4 hours. I spoke for less than 20 minutes. Most of that time was spent answering operational questions: production efficiency, capital investments, regulatory compliance, leadership structure, business continuity. Nobody asked me whether I loved my mother. Nobody asked whether Ethan deserved another chance. Those weren't governance questions. Victoria spoke for nearly an hour. She defended every organizational decision she had made. Harmony has always been exceptional operationally. She looked toward the directors. But running a company requires more than operational excellence. Charles asked calmly, "What qualities do you believe are missing?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "Leadership requires trust." Margaret followed immediately. "Do you believe Harmony is dishonest?" "No." "Unethical?" "No." "Incompetent?" "Certainly not." Margaret remained composed. "Then specifically, what makes her unqualified?" For the first time that morning, my mother hesitated. Finally, she answered, "She's too rigid." Charles looked down at his notes, meaning, she follows policies even when flexibility would better serve relationships. The room became very quiet. One of the independent directors, David Rosen, finally spoke. Mrs. Vargas, she turned toward him, can you provide an example where Ms. Vargas's commitment to policy materially harmed the company? Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Several seconds passed. No. David nodded politely. Can you provide an example where her operational decisions caused measurable financial loss? Again, no. Charles made a short note. No one commented. No one needed to. Facts had a way of filling silence. After lunch, Ethan addressed the board. I almost felt sorry for him. He genuinely believed this meeting was about convincing everyone he was ready to become CEO. He spoke confidently about growth, innovation, expansion, market opportunities. The presentation sounded polished. Then Charles interrupted. Mr. Vargas. Yes. Who led the Midwest Manufacturing Optimization Project? Ethan smiled. I did. Charles glanced toward me. Harmony, I answered honestly. I served as executive project lead. Charles looked back at Ethan. Can you explain the discrepancy? Ethan frowned. My understanding is that I sponsored the initiative. Margaret opened a binder. The original project charter lists Harmony Vargas. She turned another page. The budget approvals list Harmony Vargas. Another page. The implementation committee lists Harmony Vargas. One more. The FDA correspondence lists Harmony Vargas. She looked directly at Ethan. So, we're trying to understand why the final committee minutes identify you instead. Ethan looked genuinely confused. He turned toward my mother. Victoria spoke before he could. Titles were adjusted to reflect executive oversight. Charles immediately asked, when, after implementation? Why? To reflect organizational leadership. Amelia quietly slid another document across the table. The audit log indicates the change occurred 73 days after board approval. No one spoke. Margaret asked softly, was the board informed that approved records had been materially revised? Victoria answered. It wasn't necessary. Charles looked up. Under our governance policy, he opened the handbook. Material amendments to approved board records require notification. The sentence hung in the room. Victoria remained silent. Over the next 2 weeks, the governance committee expanded its review. They weren't investigating criminal conduct. They were examining governance practices. That distinction mattered. The committee reviewed project files from the previous 3 years. Not just 1, not just 2, 3. Michael Dawson was interviewed twice. Nathan Brooks produced complete audit logs. Olivia Grant provided distribution records for board materials. Every witness was asked the same question. Did you alter records? No. Were you instructed to? No. Did you observe unusual changes? Several answered yes. Not dramatic changes, subtle ones, executive sponsor names, presentation credits, committee attendance, distribution lists. Individually, none of them seemed significant. Together, they formed a pattern. The pattern showed that successful initiatives gradually became associated with Ethan after completion. The failed projects never changed. It was almost elegant in its simplicity. No lies, just revisions. Enough revisions repeated over several years slowly created an entirely different history. One afternoon, Nathan visited my office carrying a sealed envelope. I thought you'd want to know. What is it? The governance committee requested a forensic summary. He placed it on my desk. I wasn't allowed to give you the report. So why are you here? He smiled. To tell you something that isn't confidential. I'm listening.
In 15 years working in cybersecurity, he adjusted his glasses. I've never seen anyone manipulate a narrative so gradually. I looked at him. It wasn't one edit. No, it was hundreds. He nodded, each one small enough to avoid attention. But together, they changed who appeared to have built this company. After he left, I sat quietly. I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad. Not because my career had been diminished, because I finally understood something painful. My mother hadn't woken up one morning and decided to erase me. She had done it one document at a time, one committee at a time, one credit at a time. Each decision had probably felt harmless, temporary, understandable, until years later the official history no longer resembled reality. 3 days before the scheduled CEO election, every board member received the governance committee's final report. No recommendations, no opinions, just facts, audit logs, board records, succession procedures, the authenticated succession review letter. That afternoon, Charles Bennett sent one final email. Special meeting confirmed. Agenda item 1, CEO election. Agenda item 2, governance resolution. Less than 5 minutes later, my office phone rang. It was my mother. Harmony. Yes. Her voice was unusually calm. I'd like you to come to my office. When? Now. There was no anger, no accusation, no emotion at all. Just a quiet certainty. As I walked toward the CEO's suite, I noticed Ethan already standing outside her office. He looked pale. When our eyes met, he said something I never expected to hear. I don't think Mom told me everything. He stepped aside and opened the door for me. Victoria was standing alone beside the window, holding a folder I recognized immediately. It was my father's handwriting on the cover. For a moment, none of us spoke. My mother stood with her back to the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, the afternoon sunlight outlining her silhouette. The folder in her hands was worn at the edges, its faded blue cover unmistakably familiar. My father's handwriting. She noticed my eyes settle on it. I wondered when you'd finally find the other documents, she said quietly. I glanced at Ethan. He looked as confused as I felt. You've had that all this time, I asked. Victoria nodded. I have. Then why move the archives? She looked down at the folder. Because I didn't want people reading pieces of your father's plans without understanding all of them. I frowned. What does that mean? She walked to the conference table and placed the folder in front of us. I never destroyed anything. I never changed his letter. I never forged a signature. She took a slow breath. But I did remove documents from circulation. Why, because I believed your father underestimated what would happen after he died. Her voice wasn't defensive. It sounded tired, almost defeated. I watched investors question us. I watched competitors try to buy us. I watched banks wonder whether we would survive. She looked directly at me. And I watched 2 children grieve in completely different ways. Ethan lowered his eyes. Victoria continued. You disappeared into work. She turned toward him. You disappeared into people. Neither of us argued. She wasn't wrong. I believed the company needed one child who could unite everyone. Her eyes rested on Ethan. I convinced myself that was him. I asked the question that had haunted me for months. And me? She closed her eyes for a brief moment. I thought you'd stay. Those 4 words hit harder than every argument we'd ever had. I thought, she swallowed. Oh, no matter how unfair it seemed, you'd stay because you loved this company. I do love this company. I know. And you used that against me. Silence. She didn't deny it. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, his voice cracked. Did you really change those records? She looked at him. I approved revisions. Why? I wanted the board to see you as ready. I wasn't. The room became very still. I never asked you to do that. I know. I honestly thought... He shook his head. I thought I'd earned those opportunities. She looked at him with genuine sadness. I wanted you to believe you had. It was the first completely honest thing I'd heard in months, perhaps years. Ethan sat down slowly. I've been giving interviews. I've been talking about projects. He looked at me. They were yours. I answered carefully. They were ours. He shook his head. No. I remember enough now. You handled almost everything. He looked as though someone had removed the ground beneath him. I thought I was becoming Dad. Victoria whispered. I wanted that too. No one spoke again. Eventually, she pushed the folder toward me. Open it. Inside was another governance memorandum, not the succession review letter. Something different. A draft. Handwritten notes covered the margins. Several sentences had been crossed out. Others had been rewritten in my father's handwriting. One paragraph caught my attention immediately. Leadership built on family preference eventually weakens both the family and the company. I looked up. Why didn't you ever show this to the board? Victoria answered honestly. Because I didn't want them asking whether I'd ignored his advice. There it was. Not greed, not hatred, fear. Years of fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of failing my father. Fear of admitting she'd already drifted away from the principles that had built Vargas Biotech. The next morning, the board convened for what everyone knew would be the most important meeting in the company's history. At exactly 9 o'clock, Charles Bennett called the meeting to order. Every director was present. Amelia Foster sat beside him. Michael Dawson occupied the seat reserved for finance. Nathan Brooks had been invited for technical questions regarding audit logs. My mother and Ethan sat together. I sat alone across the table. Charles opened the meeting. Today's purpose is twofold. He looked around the room. First, we will address the governance committee's findings. Second, we will elect the next chief executive officer. No one interrupted. Margaret Sinclair summarized the committee's work. No dramatic language, no accusations, just chronology, audit logs, distribution lists, meeting revisions, succession procedures, authentication of my father's documents. When she finished, Charles turned to Amelia. As general counsel, he folded his hands. What is your legal opinion? Amelia answered without hesitation. The committee found no evidence of fraud. My mother closed her eyes briefly. But, Amelia continued, the evidence does establish repeated governance failures. She explained each point carefully. Approved board records had been materially revised without proper notification. Succession planning had excluded key executives without documented business justification. Historical's project records had been altered after approval, creating misleading executive histories. None of those findings automatically created criminal liability. All of them undermined confidence in corporate governance. Charles nodded. Thank you. He then looked toward my mother. Mrs. Vargas, would you like to respond? Victoria stood. For the first time in my life, I saw her without certainty. I won't dispute the committee's findings. A few directors exchanged surprised looks. I believed I was protecting Vargas Biotech. She looked toward Ethan. I confused protecting the company with protecting my son. Then she looked at me. And I assumed my daughter would always sacrifice her own future because she loved this company. Her voice softened. That assumption was unfair. She sat down.
No speeches, no excuses, just one honest admission. Charles allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. The governance committee has submitted one formal resolution. Amelia handed every director a printed copy. The resolution recommended that the board reaffirm the succession procedures established under the company's governance framework, including the independent review provisions contained in my father's authenticated documents. Charles asked for discussion. None came. All in favor. One by one, hands rose. Every independent director. Then Michael Dawson, serving as the executive financial representative. The resolution passed unanimously. Charles gave the document to Amelia. Please enter it into the permanent corporate record. She nodded. It will be. Then Charles looked around the room once more. The governance matter is concluded. He paused. We now move to the election of the next chief executive officer. Amelia distributed sealed ballots. No one spoke while the votes were cast. Each director folded a ballot, placed it into the wooden ballot box, waited. Charles counted them with Margaret beside him. The room was silent except for the sound of paper unfolding. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at Ethan. I watched Charles. When he finished counting, he placed the final ballot on top of the stack. He read the total once, then again. Margaret quietly verified the count. Charles slipped the results into a plain white envelope. He sealed it. Then he looked toward every person seated around the table. I have the certified result. He rested one hand on the envelope. And before I announce it, his eyes met mine for only a moment. There is one final statement the board believes should be entered into the official record. No one moved. Charles Bennett placed the sealed election envelope beside the stack of governance documents instead of opening it immediately. At first I didn't understand why. Then he looked toward Olivia Grant. Ms. Grant, before we certify today's election, please read the board's prepared statement into the record. Olivia adjusted her glasses. She had recorded hundreds of board meetings over the past 23 years. I had never heard her voice shake. It did now. She unfolded a single page. This statement was drafted jointly by the independent directors following the completion of the governance committee's review. She looked around the room before continuing. The board of directors recognizes that Vargas Biotech's long-term success has depended upon the efforts of many individuals whose contributions must be documented accurately and fairly. She paused. Our review determined that historical executive records failed to consistently reflect actual operational leadership. Another pause. The board therefore directs that all affected governance records be restored to accurately represent project leadership committee participation and executive responsibilities. I closed my eyes for a brief second. Not because I was emotional about receiving credit, because someone had finally acknowledged that history mattered. Not for my ego, for the integrity of the company. Olivia continued reading. The board further affirms that succession decisions shall be based solely upon demonstrated leadership, fiduciary responsibility, ethical conduct, and the long-term interests of the corporation. She looked toward Charles. End of statement. Charles nodded. Please enter it into the permanent minutes. I will. There would be no quiet revisions this time. Every word would remain exactly where the board placed it. Charles finally picked up the sealed envelope. The certified vote, he opened it carefully, has been verified. Every sound in the room disappeared. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. He looked down once more before speaking. By a vote of 10-2, he lifted his eyes. The board of directors elects Harmony Vargas as the next chief executive officer of Vargas Biotech effective immediately. No applause followed. This wasn't a celebration. It was corporate governance doing exactly what it was designed to do. Charles stood first. "Congratulations, Ms. Vargas." I stood automatically.
"Thank you."
He extended his hand. I shook it. One by one, the other directors did the same. Margaret smiled warmly.
"You earned this."
David Rosen nodded.
"The evidence earned it."
I appreciated that even more. Michael Dawson approached next. He had known my father longer than anyone in the room.
"I'm sorry."
"For what?"
"For waiting so long before saying anything."
I shook my head. "You pointed me toward the records."
"I should have done it sooner." "Maybe."
I smiled gently.
"But you did it when it mattered."
His shoulders relaxed.
"I hope so."
Across the room, Ethan remained seated. He wasn't angry. He looked exhausted, almost relieved. After the directors finished speaking with me, he walked over quietly.
"I owe you an apology."
"You don't owe me anything today."
"I do."
He looked directly into my eyes.
"I built my confidence on accomplishments I honestly believed were mine."
I believed him. That was the tragedy. He hadn't orchestrated the revisions. He had lived inside them.
"I'm sorry
I never asked more questions." I nodded slowly.
"So am I."
He laughed softly.
"That's probably the nicest way anyone has ever accepted an apology."
"I don't think you were trying to hurt me."
"No."
He looked toward our mother.
"I just never realized how much she was protecting me."
There was sadness in his voice, not resentment. Recognition. He extended his hand. For a second I looked at it, then I hugged him instead. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was simply two siblings acknowledging that neither of us had escaped the consequences of our mother's decisions. When we stepped apart, Ethan smiled weakly.
"I think I need to figure out who I actually am without everyone telling me."
"I think that's worth figuring out." He nodded.
"I'll probably leave the executive team."
"That's your decision."
"It is."
For the first time, it truly was. Victoria remained near the window while everyone else gradually left the boardroom. She hadn't cried. She hadn't argued. She simply stood quietly watching the skyline. I walked over. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, she broke the silence.
"Your father would have been proud today."
I looked out the window.
"I hope so."
"He would." She folded her hands. "I kept thinking leadership meant protecting people from disappointment." She smiled sadly. "I forgot that leadership also means letting people earn disappointment." I understood what she meant. She had tried to protect Ethan from failure. Instead, she had protected him from growth. "I made him dependent on me," she whispered, "and I almost cost you everything." I didn't answer immediately. There wasn't anything to argue with. She was right. After another long silence, she turned toward me.
I've already prepared my resignation."
I frowned.
"From the CEO position." "Yes, I expected that."
"And from the board." That surprised me.
"You don't have to resign from the board."
"I should." I thought carefully before answering.
"The board will decide that."
She nodded.
"Fair enough."
Then she reached into her briefcase.
"I almost forgot."
She handed me a familiar envelope, the one Eleanor Hayes had given me days earlier. Still sealed, my name written in my father's handwriting. "I never opened it," Victoria smiled faintly. "I couldn't. You knew what it was. I knew it wasn't mine." I looked down at the envelope. My fingers traced my father's handwriting. Victoria touched my arm gently. "Read it tonight." Then she walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped. Without looking back, she said quietly, "Harmony, yes. I spent years believing I was preparing one child to lead. She paused. I never realized the other one had already become the leader. The door closed softly behind her. Late that evening, after the building had emptied, I walked into the CEO office for the first time. Not as someone's daughter, not as someone's replacement. As the person the board had chosen. The office looked almost unchanged. My father's old bookshelf still stood against the west wall, the same brass desk clock, the same framed photograph of our company's first manufacturing facility. I sat behind the desk. For several minutes, I did nothing. Then I placed my father's unopened letter in front of me. I carefully broke the seal. The first line immediately blurred my vision. It read, "Harmony, if you're reading this, the board has already made its decision, and I hope you understand that this letter was never about becoming CEO." I sat alone in the CEO's office long after sunset, my father's letter spread across the desk. Outside Chicago's skyline shimmered against Lake Michigan. Inside the building was almost silent. His handwriting was exactly as I remembered, steady, deliberate, impossible to mistake. The first sentence had already taken my breath away. "Harmony, if you're reading this, the board has already made its decision, and I hope you understand that this letter was never about becoming CEO." I continued reading. "Titles are temporary. Character is not." A smile appeared before I realized it. That sounded exactly like him. He wrote about the first warehouse where he and my mother had worked 12-hour days beside a handful of employees. He wrote about the years when they couldn't afford new equipment and celebrated every contract because it meant another family could keep paying their mortgage. Then his letter became more personal. "If you become CEO, remember that the company doesn't belong to you." He underlined the next sentence. "It belongs to every employee who trusts its future to your decisions." I leaned back in the chair. For weeks, I had been focused on proving what had happened. My father was reminding me to think about what happened next. The future mattered more than the victory. The following morning, I held my first executive leadership meeting as CEO. Nothing about the room had changed. The same conference table, the same department heads, the same agenda screens. But the atmosphere was different. People weren't wondering who had won. They were wondering what kind of leader I would become. I began with something that surprised everyone. "I don't want to spend today talking about the board vote." Several executives exchanged glances. "We've spent enough time looking backward." I paused. "Today we're going to talk about how decisions will be made from this point forward." I projected a new governance policy onto the screen. It contained 5 principles. Every executive appointment would require documented qualifications. Leadership evaluations would be conducted by independent committees. Major governance records could no longer be amended after board approval without formal disclosure. Project leadership would be documented at every stage rather than after completion. And finally, no member of the Vargas family would receive different standards than any other executive. I looked around the room. "That includes me." Silence filled the room. Then Michael Dawson smiled. "I think your father would approve." "I hope so." Nathan Brooks raised a hand. "Does this also apply to audit access?" "It does." "Every revision log." "Everyone." He nodded once. "Good." Olivia Grant quietly added, "It will make the board's work much easier." "That's the idea." The meeting ended with something I hadn't expected. Several department directors remained behind, not to congratulate me, to thank me. One of our plant managers spoke first. "I've worked here 26 years. "I know. I've never seen governance discuss this openly." Another manager nodded. "It makes people feel safer." That comment stayed with me. Safety wasn't just about manufacturing plants. It was about culture, about knowing that work would be evaluated fairly. 3 weeks later, Ethan requested a meeting. He walked into my office carrying a notebook instead of a presentation.
I've made a decision. I motioned for him to sit. I'm resigning as executive vice president. I wasn't surprised. What are you planning to do? He laughed. For the first time in my life. He looked down at the notebook. I honestly don't know. I've enrolled in an executive operations program. That caught my attention. Operations. I realized something. He smiled awkwardly. I've spent years talking about leadership. I've never really learned the business. I admired his honesty. I'd like to come back someday. You can. He looked relieved. But not because I'm your brother. I smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I want to earn it. You should. We shook hands. This time, neither of us needed anyone else's approval. A month after Ethan resigned, the board met again. One agenda item remained unresolved: Victoria's future. Several directors believed she should leave entirely. Others argued that removing the company's longest-serving executive would erase decades of valuable experience. Charles Bennett finally turned to me. As CEO, do you have a recommendation? Every eye in the room shifted toward me. For months, people had assumed this moment would be my opportunity for revenge. Instead, I answered calmly, I recommend that Victoria Vargas be invited to serve as senior strategic advisor. Several directors looked surprised. I continued, the role should have no voting authority, no executive authority, no influence over succession decisions, only advisory responsibilities when requested. Margaret smiled before anyone else reacted. Charles nodded thoughtfully. Why? Because governance isn't strengthened by humiliation. I looked around the table. It's strengthened by clear boundaries. The company can benefit from her experience, but the rules must apply equally to everyone. The resolution passed 8-4. Victoria accepted. When she thanked me afterward, I stopped her gently. This isn't a favor. I know. It's a role with limits. She smiled. I know that too. For the first time in years, we understood one another. Not perfectly, but honestly. 6 months later, Vargas Biotech reported its strongest employee engagement scores in more than a decade. Board meetings became shorter. Project records became cleaner. Succession planning became transparent. Employees no longer whispered about which family member would receive special treatment. They talked about results. One Friday evening, I walked through our original manufacturing facility before heading home. Many of the employees didn't even notice I was there. They were busy solving problems, helping one another, and finishing another successful production week. Exactly as my father would have wanted. Before leaving, I stopped in front of the framed photograph of the company's first warehouse. Beneath it hung a small bronze plaque we had installed after the governance reforms. It didn't mention my name. It didn't mention my father's. It simply read, "Integrity leaves the strongest legacy." As I turned off the office lights, I realized something my mother and I had both misunderstood for years. Running a company was never about being chosen over someone else. It was about creating a place where no one would ever have to question whether they had been treated fairly. That was the legacy my father had hoped for. And finally, it had become ours. When someone betrays you, especially someone in your own family, it's easy to believe that justice means watching them lose everything. But life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the deepest form of justice is seeing the truth documented, acknowledged, and allowed to stand on its own. Harmony's story reminds us that healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge, they are acts of responsibility. You can forgive someone without giving them the same access they once had. You can respect their humanity while refusing to repeat the patterns that caused the pain. If you've ever been overlooked, manipulated, or expected to sacrifice your future simply because you were the dependable one,
I hope this story reminds you that your worth doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to recognize it. Evidence. Integrity, patience, and consistency often speak louder than anger ever could. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting your own integrity? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who needs to hear it today. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice, healing, and finding the courage to set healthy boundaries, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for more journeys like this. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.